So, in this lecture, we are going to talk about the most consequential event of the 20th century, and that is World War One. What a lot of people have a tendency to assume is that of the two world wars, that World War Two is the most consequential, the most important, the most significant. But here's what I want you to understand. World War II is really just a continuation of World War One, okay? And the 1920s and the 1930s are what I describe as halftime, all right? World War II is really rooted in what happens and begins in World War One. So when we talk about the events of World War One, here's what I want you to know. And this is a little bit of a, spoiler alert, but some of the issues that we're dealing with now, whether we're talking about issues in the Middle East, particularly with Israel and Palestine, or how borders are created all throughout the Middle East, all of that stuff, a lot of that is rooted in how World War One comes to an end. So listen, when I tell you that World War One is consequential, there's a lot going on. So brace yourself for the amount of information that's about to come your way. So I want to start in a kind of weird way and give you a little bit of context here and talk about where the Americans are at in terms of our mentality. Leading into the 19 teens. Okay. So in the previous lecture, talking about when we were talking about the limits of freedom during the Gilded Age, right? One of the things that's happening in the Gilded Age that sort of contributes to this idea of success and expansion is that there is a debate on whether or not it would be worth becoming or establishing an American empire, right? At that point, we had stretched ourselves from coast to coast, and we talked about this in the Gilded Age lecture that we had pushed for westward expansion. Railroads are out there, companies are out there, people are settling out there. And so as a result, people start talking about, okay, what do we do next? Should we become an empire? And so this becomes a real debate because there are a lot of people who are not interested. There are a lot of people who argue, why would we become an empire when we fought for independence from an empire? Wouldn't becoming an empire be counterintuitive? Wouldn't that be against our very identity? I mean, here we are talking about the value of independence, and now we're going to become an empire? That doesn't make sense. But there are two primary arguments that help to support this or help to promote this idea of becoming an empire. One, there's nowhere else to expand. And Americans are, as some of these people will argue, Americans are a people who like to expand. We like to explore. We like to discover. And when I say discover, I'm putting that in air quotes because we're not really discovering a whole lot when it comes to expansion, especially when people are already living there. Shout out to the indigenous peoples. So when we talk about this whole idea of empire, empire is not presented in this way as conquering places as much as it is exploration and expansion and discovery. This is who we are. This is what we do. We've already extended ourselves to the West Coast. Let's see what else is out there. The second argument, or the second sort of topic that comes up, is the fact that our economic competitors and even our military competitors, primarily in Europe, all of those guys are already empires. They've been empires. We're talking about Spain, we're talking about France, we're talking about Portugal, we're talking about Britain. These guys have been empires, and look what they've gained for themselves. Look at how much wealth that they have. Look at how powerful that they've been. Look at how much their economies have grown as a result of being empires. So why not be a part of that, right? This is a debate that sort of comes and goes because here's the thing. You have to convince two groups of people that becoming an empire is worthwhile. One, you have to convince the American people. And two, you have to convince American leaders. You have to convince political leaders. You have to convince military leaders. You have to convince economic leaders, because becoming an empire is expensive. Becoming an empire is time consuming. Becoming an empire is risky, right? It's, it can be dangerous. So now the question becomes, how do you convince all of these people that empires are worth creating? So the first argument that I want to talk about will come for the American people, and it comes from a guy named Josiah Strong. Josiah Strong writes a book called Our Country, Its Possible Future, and Its Present Crisis. You can see the opening page there. Josiah Strong writes this book in 1885. And just so you have an idea of who this guy is, he was a Protestant minister, and he is one of the originators, one of the creators behind the social gospel movement. We talked about the social gospel movement in the last lecture on the progressive era. It's about using the gospel to justify ministering to the physical needs of the people and not just the spiritual needs of people. So in this book, Strong writes about several things. He talks about missionary activity. That's his primary focus. And he says that American Christians, the Protestants, need to be focused on becoming or serving as missionaries, right? And so, of course, he says we really need to expand our missionary activity in the United States. So right here at home, we need more missionaries. He says we need more missionaries in the West. And he says that because, of the Chinese population. He says that about the indigenous population. And he also says that we need missionaries in larger cities. So he's talking about, larger cities with large immigrant populations. He also says, listen, there are racial tensions across the country. We have a responsibility to resolve those racial tensions. We can't avoid those problems. He says all this because he says, listen, there are things that are threatening our country's survival. They're threatening our country's Christianization, and they're threatening our country's greatness. And that's what the title is about. Our country, its possible future, and its present crisis. Okay, so the crisis is coming from, as he identifies, he is arguing this. I just want to make sure to emphasize that. He says that the threat to the country's survival and Christianity and greatness is coming from Catholicism, Mormonism, greed, wealth, immigration, urbanization, and of course, socialism. These many things are looking at or trying to challenge the very cultural identity of the country. And Strong says that it is up to the Protestants of America to fight back against that. That's why he says that missionaries have to go across the country as it is to help counteract that, to minister to people, to make sure that the Catholics don't get the best of them, I guess, or that the Mormons don't spread further, or that socialism doesn't take hold, right? But then he gets to one particular part of the book where he talks about racial status in general. And he says, he makes this argument, and this is what I want you to emphasize in your notes. Strong argues that all races could be uplifted and improved, and of course, as a result, be brought to salvation, right? That Jesus can save all of these races. And the way that could happen is if the Anglo-Saxon race, so in his context, what he means is those particular people from Europe who spoke English, the Anglo-Saxons, led the way in this missionary work. So if Anglo-Saxon Christians, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, so he is very strongly, quite obviously, grasping on to this WASP argument, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants led the way as missionaries, that they could uplift the races, not just in this country, but around the world, and bring them all to Christ. Okay? And then not only does he say that they could do that, he says, and this is what you should underline, he says they have the responsibility to do that. They have the responsibility to, and I quote, civilize and Christianize the world. They have the responsibility to civilize and Christianize the world. So, in other words, what he is telling the American people is that as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you have a responsibility you have a God calling on you, right? You have a divine obligation to Christianize and civilize non-white, non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Protestant peoples. Okay? The way you can do that is by becoming an empire, because as an empire, your nation, your people will be everywhere around the world. And under your nation's flag, you can work as a missionary. So if the United States is present in a place like the Philippines, then you can go to the Philippines and be a missionary there. He is appealing to regular American people that way. So that's one side of it. How do you appeal then to American leadership? How do you reach out to businessmen, to military leaders, to politicians, and how do you justify it that way? Because preaching the gospel is not the way that you're going to convince those guys, right? So that is going to come from a book entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon World History, or Upon History, which is written by Alfred T. Mahan, Captain Alfred T. Mahan, and published in 1890. So Mahan is a lecturer in naval history, and at the time he was president of the United States Naval Academy. So in 1890, he writes this book in which he argues that a combination of a couple of things. One, the British control of the seas, and two, the decline of other European countries' naval strength. That's what led to the strength of the British Empire. At one time in global history, the British Empire was not only the world's most powerful empire, it was the world's most extensive empire. And the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And they meant that literally, that you could not go anywhere in the world where you didn't run into somewhere that had been colonized by the British. Okay? That's how extensive the British Empire was. And Mahan says that the reason why the British had become that powerful is because of their navy, and the fact that Spain's navy, we call it the Spanish Armada, the French Navy, all of their naval power had diminished while the British had built theirs up. And it had been so powerful that what ends up happening is not only was their military dominant, but they dominated in world politics. They also dominated in world economics. So they are financially at the top of the scale. They were militarily at the top of the scale. So what he's what he's ultimately arguing is this: if the United States wants to be able to compete at the global level, then the United States is going to have to do the same. The United States needs to build a navy that can go anywhere and everywhere. Because remember, the world is mostly water, right? And so you've got to be able to go wherever you can. And he says this is not just about military power, right? This is not just about being able to attack someone or show your military dominance. He says it's also about economics. He says we need to be able to sell our products to more than just the people in North America, South America, or mainland Europe. Having an extensive navy will allow us to go literally anywhere in the world. So we want to be able to create new markets. So what he presents in his book essentially is the political, economic, and military benefits of having a stronger navy. And that helps to justify empire as well, because having a strong navy, to him, is the key to an empire. Now, why does all of this matter leading into World War I? It matters because it gives you a peek into the mindset of American leadership going into the early 20th century, right? Because going into the early 20th century, we are starting to enter into an era of intervention, particularly beginning with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, who I should add here because I love talking about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is a speed reader, and he is an avid reader at that. So that means that he can read books at a rapid pace. So he is known to read several books a day. And not only can he read those books, he can also retain the information. So one of the books that he absolutely falls in love with is Mahan's book. And he even writes to Mahan, and then later meets him, and he says to Mahan, "This is the book I've been waiting for. This is the book that I think is the key to American greatness." And so, with Mahan's book in the back of his mind, when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, he is really convinced that it is time for the Americans to really step up on the global stage and take on a role of leadership. So one of the early things that Roosevelt does is he creates something called the Roosevelt Corollary. So I want to create some definitions here so that you understand what corollary means in this context, okay? So a corollary is essentially an addition to what has already been issued. It's, or not just an addition, it's an amendment almost. And what this is an amendment to is the Monroe Doctrine. So if any of you remember the Monroe Doctrine, first of all, congratulations to you. But in case you don't, here's what it says. The Monroe Doctrine was presented under President James Monroe. And essentially, it's our first real stand as a global power against not just one country, but all of European empires. And the message is this: whatever country you have colonized here in the Western Hemisphere, that's great, but you cannot add any more nations to your empire. You are done conquering the Western Hemisphere. That's Monroe's message to Europe. And that's Monroe's message to any outside power, that there will be no more conquering, no more colonizing in the Western Hemisphere. That's done. Okay, it's a major statement to make because essentially what he is saying is that we are now taking ownership of our space, of our place on the global stage, and We will watch out for each other. We are now, looking out for ourselves. And Roosevelt decides he needs to add to that policy. He says that not only can the other countries in the world, but especially the Europeans, not colonize, he says that if something happens in any country in the Western Hemisphere, if there is a revolution, if there is a war or some kind of conflict, then the United States will be the one to take care of it. The United States will lead the way in handling that issue. Europe needs to mind their business. In other words, what he is doing is he's presenting the United States as an international police power for the Western Hemisphere. An international police power in the Western Hemisphere. We are going to be the ones to protect everybody. So if Canada is going through some kind of uprising, then we will jump in and intervene and help the Canadians. If something goes on in Peru, then we are going to intervene and help out and do what needs to be done. England cannot come over here. France can't come over here and say, we have economic interests. That's too bad. This is what we can do in our hemisphere. The reason why he's doing this is because he wants to pave the way for something bigger. And the something bigger is this. Roosevelt believes very strongly that the Americans have a responsibility to be involved in global affairs and interfere when necessary. In other words, Roosevelt has a strong issue about international affairs. He cannot mind his own business. For example, when Russia and Japan go to war, he immediately gets involved. And what ends up happening is he leads the negotiations to bring the war to an end. And he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. But that's the kind of thing that Roosevelt does. Roosevelt is going to be the president who paves the way for American intervention. He is going to be the guy who opens that door. That's what I want you to be mindful of. He is the guy who basically says, this is our job, this is our responsibility. So make sure that you are continuing it going forward. Now, his successor is a guy named William Howard Taft. Taft takes it a slightly different way. He believes in something called dollar diplomacy. And essentially what he's arguing is not that we take an aggressive position, that we just interfere wherever we're interested or anything like that. What he says is we need to protect the places where we are financially invested. So if there is a sugar corporation that is invested in the sugar industries or the sugar plantations of Cuba, and there is a war that breaks out there, which is something that actually happened in the 1890s, then we have to go in there and interfere and make sure that nothing happens to our investment. So in other words, we need to set up diplomatic relations meaning we need to be able to set up, create a relationship where we can negotiate, where we can create trade relations, where we can have an ambassador, all of that stuff, anywhere where we have investments, anywhere where we have financial interests. So our interference or our foreign policy should follow our dollar. That's what Taft argues. Woodrow Wilson is going to be very different from these two men. And Woodrow Wilson is going to be the key figure for the remainder of this lecture. So get ready to hear his name a lot. Also, get ready to hear a lot of bitterness in the tone of my voice because Wilson and I don't get along. So Woodrow Wilson has a couple of approaches to foreign policy. So I need you to, underneath Woodrow Wilson, create a couple of columns, I guess, for yourself, if that helps. But I want you to be able to differentiate between how he approaches foreign policy. So there's a couple of ways. The first way is his idea of self-determination. So he says, listen, this whole idea of interference is kind of problematic. He thinks that Theodore Roosevelt has a problem with minding his own business. He just can't do it. Wilson's not interested in being super aggressive. He's not interested in just jumping in and doing things to other countries, getting involved in other countries' issues. Theodore Roosevelt, for example, is responsible for creating the Panama Canal, and of course, he does that without asking permission from the Panamanians. He actually artificially starts a revolution between the Panamanians and the Colombians. Listen, it's just all sorts of chaos and drama, and it's very typical of Roosevelt. But Wilson says, I don't want anything to do with that. Instead, Americans are responsible to allow countries to determine their own political identity. That's self-determination. So think of that term and define it as you see it. Self-determination means determining yourself, determining your own identity. Each country should have the ability and opportunity to determine their own political identity. So if a country has been established, then they have the right to write their own constitutions, determine how their government is going to be set up. Do they want a king? Do they want a president? Do they want, a prime minister? Whatever, that's up to them. We should not be the ones to tell them what kind of government to have, what kind of constitution to create. That's none of our business. So that's part one of his foreign policy. Part two is a little bit different. Wilson very strongly believes in America's, as I describe here, America's sense of moral imperialism. What I mean by that is he believes that the United States has a responsibility to spread the good news, not of the gospel, but spread the good news of democracy. That we are the world's greatest example of how and why democracy works and why every country should have some form of democracy. We should teach people about that. Okay? He believes that this is a moral issue. So in other words, when we talk about morals, think of ethics, think of values, right? A belief system. He says that the core of our belief system, at the heart of our identity, is the fact that we are a democracy. And so as a democracy, we have a responsibility to spread the good news of democracy around the world. Now, what he says is if democracy is threatened anywhere, this is what I want you to make to write down and remember. If democracy is threatened anywhere, then the Americans have to intervene, and the Americans have to fight for the cause of democracy. That's what we fight for. That's where we interfere. If democracy is threatened, then Americans will fight. I want to point out the political cartoon in the corner, the bottom right corner. That's an image of Woodrow Wilson pointing a baton at these two men. I want to, let's see if I can point this out here. So they are standing in Mexico. So this guy is Pancho Villa. And this guy is another revolutionary, Carranza. So what is happening here is in 1913, there is a military coup that happens in Mexico. The military overthrow the standing government in Mexico. And Mexico at that time had a democracy. So when the military coup takes place, Wilson immediately sends in the American army. He sends in the army and says, absolutely not. We will not tolerate this. And they start to fight. And he threatens an all-out war, right? While Americans are sort of dumbfounded by this and confused, Wilson turns to this argument of America's moral standing on democracy. He says, this is what we are going to fight for. This is what we are called to do. And that's going to be important for you to remember as we go further into the war. Okay, now before I get into the long-term causes of the war, I need to make some introductions here so that you understand who we're talking about. So let me move this up here so that way you have a clear view. So these three men, I'm not sure if you can tell, these three men are related, and all of them are monarchs of three different countries. So on the left, as you can see, is Kaiser Wilhelm. He is the leader of Germany. In the middle is King George V, who is the king of the United Kingdom. He is King Charles, like the present king of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. He is King Charles's great grandfather. Okay. And then there's Tsar Nicholas. Tsar Nicholas is the Tsar of Russia. So let's talk about how these guys are related. So George and Wilhelm. So this guy and this guy are first cousins on their father's side. Both of them have the same grandmother or the same grandparents. Their grandmother is Queen Victoria. And just so you know, Queen Victoria had 9 children. They end up having 42 grandchildren. Of the 42 grandchildren, 7 of them sat on European thrones. So put that, like pin that to your brain for a second. Let me change colors here. So then there's King George and Tsar Nicholas. I mean, their faces are almost exactly alike. These two guys are first cousins on George's mother's side. So Nicholas and George's mothers, both of their mothers were sisters. That's how they're first cousins. Now, Nicholas and Wilhelm are first cousins in law. And by that, I mean, let's pick a slightly different color here. Let's go with green. So their first cousin, a woman, actually marries Nicholas. And that's how she ends up on the Russian throne, which is how he ends up related to him. They're cousins-in-law. And of course, George then is doubly related to Nicholas because now not only is he first cousins with Nicholas, he's also cousins-in-law with Nicholas. That brings me back to Victoria and Albert. They're 42 grandchildren, 7 of whom are on European thrones. These European thrones are Russia, because her granddaughter is married to Nicholas, Greece, Romania, Britain, because here's this guy, Germany, because here's this particular nut job, and Spain and Norway. Okay. Now, when we talk about why this is important, what I want you to understand is that there is a really friendly relationship between the three of them. George and Nicholas in particular are very friendly, very close. But, for the most part, the three of them get along. Wilhelm, however, has a very serious problem all of his life with feeling neglected and marginalized. He does feel like an outsider a lot. And Wilhelm has problems. And so, listen, if you want fun stories, let me know. And I can just tell you. But just so you know, what ends up happening is Wilhelm takes great issue with the other two in particular. And what's going to end up happening is in this desire to establish the world's greatest empire, what will result in the end is Wilhelm will end up in exile, George will stay on the throne, and Nicholas and his entire family will be executed. It is a tragic war, but it is rooted in familial tensions. So let's talk about how we get there. So, when we talk about the path to this war, here's the first thing that I need you to understand. This is not something that happens as a result of one event, okay? This is something that happens over the course of several decades. So that's what I need you to write down. This is not something that happens overnight or even over the course of 6 months. This takes decades to happen, okay? So let's start first and foremost with the unification of Germany. So in 1815, Germany is not actually the Germany we know. So, in this map that you see here at the top, this does not exist prior to 1815. It was actually a series of separate nation states. But the thing is that they all have similar cultural traits, language, government styles, economic approaches, and all of them have gone through the Second Industrial Revolution. So economically, they're doing really well. So what ends up happening is in 1815, they come to an agreement to unify under one government and one constitution. What ends up happening as a result is immediately, and I mean immediately, Germany and the German Empire becomes significantly much more powerful. Now, militarily, they're not necessarily leading the world because that's still Great Britain with their naval power, but they have the most advanced technology thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. They are the wealthiest by far thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and they are the most united thanks to this new constitution and new government. And immediately there are questions. France wants to know why they have united. Great Britain wants to know why they've united. In other words, what is the motivation here? Because unification isn't something that just happens. Unification isn't something that happens without some kind of end goal. What is it that you want to accomplish by unifying? Because y'all were doing just fine as separate nation states. So why not just continue to be separate nation states? What do you hope to gain? So immediately, other European nations are suspect. They are trying to figure out what's going on, right? In the meantime, decades later, as the Second Industrial Revolution continues to take place, so with the German Empire sort of building towards the Second Industrial Revolution, and as it takes place, the massive arms buildup will happen on a global scale. Remember, one of the things that I told you in the Gilded Age lecture is that one of the industries that is created, established, and incredibly successful is new weaponry, the development of new weaponry. When I talk about this new weaponry, you should know that we are talking about things like tanks, chemical weapons, automatic weapons. The Germans are going to have the earliest versions of submarines. They're going to call them U-boats. Those are developed during the Second Industrial Revolution. The access to technology and knowledge and understanding in general is going to lead to the advanced kind of weaponry that will lead to this higher status of military power. Now, keep in mind, nobody's fighting a war. Nobody's fighting with anybody. There are no global tensions that are spoken out loud, at least. So, why are we building up our weapons? Where are we putting these things, and why are we stockpiling them in our backyards and in our, federal storage, whatever? That's the question. Why are we building up all of these weapons if we're not actually using them? It's because new weaponry is about power and status. And that's going to be important because all of these nations, and then you can throw in the United States towards the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, all of these nations are engaged in a race for empire. They've already established an empire that has been long-standing, but once the Germans enter the game and then the Americans enter the game, the question is, what land can we conquer and where? Right? So the competition becomes that the Europeans are going to start reaching into North Africa and Central Africa, then parts of the Middle East. For several decades, nations like the United States, European nations, and even Japan have been competing for access into China and even control of China because of their ability to hold all of these resources. So there has been this constant competition and race for empire. In addition to that, as we are turning into a new century, right? As we're transitioning from the 19th into the 20th century, there has also been a change in styles of government. Here's what I mean. This is particularly focused on what's going on in Europe. This is not to do with the Americans. So in Europe, we had gone from autocratic governments in a lot of countries, and it's starting to change to progressive governments. Autocratic governments means a government where one individual holds all the power. So that was the trend, for example, in the United Kingdom, where the monarch really had and held the political power. And then during the time prior to Albert and Victoria, it starts to transition to the prime minister and parliament. You start to see this happening in France as well, where parliament or the assembly and prime minister or a president will hold more political power than the monarch. And that means that the people participate and the people are represented in leadership rather than the political decisions and foreign policy decisions resting on the monarch. And the reason why this is problematic, and I think I have this on here. No, I don't. The reason why this is important is because autocratic governments that still existed, like, for example, in Germany, and in Austria-Hungary, and even in Spain, but this won't factor in just yet. But Austria-Hungary and Germany and in the Ottoman Empire, they are going to be particularly nervous about this sort of thing. Because when they have autocratic governments where one individual holds all the power, the fear is that their people will demand progressive style governments, that they will demand a change in who holds the power, right? That the movements that happened in Western Europe, like Great Britain and France, is going to somehow spread to their empires. These changes in government don't happen in isolated moments, and that's a genuine fear that they have, right? Now, this is going to sound really bizarre to you, but I promise you, this is going to make sense. There hasn't been a major war in a century in Europe. Okay, so when we get to 1914, It had been well over 100 years since Napoleon. And Napoleon's the guy who's been leading wars left, right, and sideways. And one of the things, if you haven't taken any form of world history or European history, then let me just tell you, the Europeans love themselves a war. When I tell you about European history, you can pick any nation, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Italians. These people are always engaged in war. We talk about the wars we've been engaged in over the course of our history, and while they are horrific and long and sacrificial and expensive and traumatic, let me tell you something about how our wars compare to theirs. Nothing. Okay? Because these people would engage in civil wars all the time. And it would be civil wars based on who would take over the throne next, right? Civil wars based on Protestants versus Catholics. Then there are wars between the English and the French. Then there are wars between the English and the Spanish. The English are involved in a lot of wars. There's wars all the time. And these are not wars that last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. These are wars that would last 20, 30 years. There's a war that literally lasts for a century. It's called the 100 Years' War. So, I mean, and it's not literally a century. It's almost a century. It's pretty close to a century. But still, you get the picture. These people love themselves a war. The fact that there hasn't been a war in a century is a little bit eerie. It's almost as if you have a couple of toddlers that you've left in a playroom. They're really loud for a long time, and then you walk away just for a minute, and it suddenly gets really quiet. You know something's happened in that other room. You just know it. So you got to go and check. That's what this is about, okay? When there is a century of no war, you know something has either happened or is about to happen. And this is incredibly important because what has happened in the year or so leading up to 1914 is the establishment of two alliances, two major alliances at that. Keep in mind, no war, no threat of war, nobody's pointing a gun at anybody, nothing. However, two alliances have been formed. Let me move this guy out of the way so you can see this map a little bit more clearly. So here are the two alliances that you should know about. There's the Triple Entente, made up of France, Great Britain, and Russia. So in this map, you'll notice that they are in the blue. And then there's the Triple Alliance. And the Triple Alliance are the countries in red. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So we are essentially looking at most of Europe engaged in these alliances, right? Spain is not involved, and you don't see the bottom half of Europe there, but that's what's going on, okay? So the Triple Entente has their alliance. The Triple Alliance have their alliance. Not a shot has been fired. Nobody's pointing a gun at anyone, but we're establishing alliances anyway. And of course, what I want you to keep in mind is you don't need an alliance. A trade partner is one thing, right? But an alliance is essentially a promise that if you are attacked, then we're jumping in to help you, right? We've got your back. We're coming in to fight with you. And that means that people know something is about to happen. So here's what happens. This guy pictured here at the bottom is the Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria. He is the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And there's a lot going on with Austria-Hungary. And if you take a look at this map, I'll point out what's happening here. So Austria-Hungary and Serbia have had some issues here. Here's Serbia and here's Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary has wanted to add Serbia as a part of the empire for a very long time. Serbia has rejected those requests. Austria-Hungary has made the argument, hey, listen, you would be a part of a larger economic complex. You would be protected by a larger military. Why wouldn't you want to be a part of an empire? Serbia says, thanks, but no thanks. We like our own national identity. We like our own constitution. We like preserving our own cultural identity. And in the meantime, Serbia has wanted to add Bosnia to its identity, right? They've wanted to, because Bosnians had the same cultural identity, shared language traits, all of this. So Serbia had been working on trying to add on to their own nation, tried to expand their nation. So, in other words, Serbia has been clashing with Austria-Hungary because Austria-Hungary kept stopping any kind of expansion into Bosnia. So, Serbia and Austria-Hungary have been clashing quite a bit. The Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife, pictured there, decide to go on tour, for whatever reason, into Bosnia. And as they go to Bosnia, there are places where they are really well welcomed. And the thing is, oh, hang on, I clicked on the wrong thing. There we go. As they are in Bosnia on June 28th of 1914, there are some really troubling events or issues that take place. So they are in this open carriage, as you can see here. So this is happening a little later in the day. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is earlier on this very day, somebody throws a bomb at their procession. It misses them and it kills somebody else, and another person is hurt. So the prince, the Archduke, and his wife, are shaken by this. Obviously, they go to a luncheon, they eat, and then they insist on going to the hospital to visit the person who was hurt. And then afterwards, they decide that they're going to continue with this parade or tour or whatever. So as they are on this tour, a guy just comes out of the crowd with a gun, and he's like in his late 20s. So he's a young guy. He just shoots them. He just openly, outright shoots them. And the guy who's driving this open roof car or whatever floors it to the nearest hospital. The wife dies on the way there to the hospital, and the Archduke dies while he's at the hospital. And what's really tragic of this is that June 28th happened to be their wedding anniversary. But that's just a side note. So here's the thing. Immediately, the Austrian government demands an investigation and demands that the Serbians do something, right? They believe that the Serbians are responsible. The Serbian government, at the very least, is responsible. And it turns out that the people responsible are tied to a Serbian terrorist group known as the Black Hand. You don't need to know that. I just like mentioning it. But the conclusion that the Austrian-Hungary Empire come to is that the Black Hand could have been stopped if the Serbian government had done something. Like the Serbian government was aware of these threats and they could have given a heads up to the empire. They could have given a heads up to the Archduke, to security, something, and they did not. So literally 1 month later, exactly 1 month later, July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. So that's it. The assassination is what leads to a declaration of war. But here's what literally nobody knows, okay? And this is what I want you to be mindful of. Remember what I told you earlier about the relationship between these two countries, right? So remember, Austria Hungary wants to take control over Serbia. So, what Serbia has done without literally anybody knowing is Serbia reaches out to the Russians. And what they have done is they have established an alliance, a secret alliance with the Russians. So when Austria Hungary declares war on Serbia, the Russians step in and declare war on the Austro Hungarians. And Austria Hungary goes, excuse me, what? I'm sorry, what did you just say? And as a result of that, the Germans immediately step in because Kaiser Wilhelm has been waiting. He wants a war. He's been waiting for a war because for him, this is a moment for him to prove his mettle. He wants to prove and demonstrate that he is a tough monarch, that he has a great vision for Germany and the German Empire, that he can do what his grandparents did, and he has a great vision for the future of Germany. And this is how he's going to prove it. So he's been waiting for this kind of opportunity, right? So, of course, as soon as the Russians declare war on Austria-Hungary, Germany immediately declares war on Serbia and the Russians, and off to the races we go. Because immediately after the Germans declare war, who else has to step in? France has to step in, and so does Great Britain, because remember, we have an alliance with the Triple Entente, and then because the Germans and the Austria-Hungarians have declared war, the Italians have stepped in. I want you to take a look at this headline from the New York Times. This is in August of 1914 because the first war declaration takes place in July 28th, on July 28th, and literally by August 3rd, you have all of these major countries getting involved. And here's the headline: Germany declares war on Russia. First shots are fired. France is mobilizing and might be drawn in tomorrow. And now the question is, holy crap, there are 100,000 Americans who are in Europe. How are we going to get them out of there? Because we can't get them stuck in the middle of Europe while Europe is in the middle of a war. Right? So how do we get them out? There's a whole thing to that, but we won't talk about it. When we talk about how drastic, how violent this war is, just to give you some kind of glimpse into this war, within the first month of the war, from July 28th to August 28th, 1 million people are dead. I'm going to say that again, and I need you to take a moment to grasp that number. Within 1 month, from July 28th to August 28th, 1 million people are dead. Not just soldiers, but we are also talking about civilians, men, women, children. That's how deadly and destructive this war is. And it is an indication of how deadly this war is going to be. Okay? And that's just the first month. And it goes to show you how advanced these weapons are, how deadly these weapons are, right? So almost immediately, the question is for Woodrow Wilson, okay, what are we going to say as Americans? How do we respond to this? And almost immediately, Wilson makes it very clear that it's none of our business. We're staying out of it. We're staying neutral. there are a couple of reasons why he declares neutrality. First and foremost, he says, we have people in this country who are from countries aligned with the Triple Alliance, and we have people in our country who are from countries in the Triple Entente, and it is unfair to them if their present country aligns itself with anyone in either alliance, right? So it is easier for us as a nation of, this melting pot of peoples, to identify ourselves with either alliance. Secondly, Wilson argues that this is not a war about ideology. This is not a war about democracy. This is not a war about, some kind of ideological value or principle. He says this is a war about territory. This is about empire. So if the Austro-Hungarians want to extend their empire and the Russians want to stop them, then that's their business. This is not something that the Americans should interfere in. We believe in self-determination. If they need to figure out, they need to figure it out. That's not something that we are going to get involved in. However, there are some moments, there are some events that take place that are sort of standout moments that we got to talk about. One takes place in May of 1915, and that is the sinking of a British passenger ship called the Lusitania. The British passenger ship is exactly that. It's basically a ship that's carrying a bunch of tourists going on vacay. So the ship had left London, went through the northern part of the Pacific Ocean, and came all the way to Boston. So it sat in Boston Harbor for a while. And I think, I want to say about a month, but I could be absolutely wrong, so don't write that down. And then it turned around. It went from Boston all the way back. And the final destination was supposed to be London. So here's what happens. It leaves it leaves Boston, excuse me. It leaves Boston and is on its way back to London when, as you can see from the New York Times headline, when the ship is attacked by a submarine. And by submarine, we're talking about a German U-boat. I want you to keep in mind here that there is no other country that has a submarine. Germany is literally the only nation at this point in time that has this technology. So, and because of that, no other nation, no other country has the technology to detect whether U-boats are in the water. We don't have sonar technology available at this time. So when a U-boat attacks, nobody is prepared for it. So it's attacked by a submarine and sunk. Probably 1,260 dead. It is twice torpedoed, and it sinks, and this is important, it sinks in 15 minutes. That's something that you should remember. That's going to be key here, okay? Here's why it sinks so quickly, okay? Now, as Americans, you read this headline and you're thinking, oh my God, those poor people. They're just people on vacay who, maybe were visiting family while they were in Boston or somewhere on the East Coast. And now, they've been attacked by the Germans. Why do civilians have to be drawn into this? Which is, of course, the immediate reaction, right? Here's why the Germans attacked the Lusitania, okay? While the Lusitania had been docked in Boston Harbor, under Woodrow Wilson's orders, the Lusitania had been packed down with American weaponry. So in the bottom of the ship, there are weapons, there are tanks, there are uniforms, there are all sorts of things, war supplies, being shipped over to England in secret. So while Wilson is publicly declaring neutrality, he is secretly siding with the English. And that's what the Germans are calling out. Germany knows that Wilson is helping the English and that he's also helping the French, right? So if it's not British passenger ships, he's also using merchant ships. So what the Germans end up doing there is they'll attack these merchant ships and take the sailors on these ships as prisoners of war. They'll also form blockades around Great Britain and France to prevent American ships from coming in, because what they argue is, hey, listen, if you're going to be neutral here, be neutral. Stay out of it entirely. Otherwise, declare your loyalty to one side or the other and get in this fight, right? But here's the thing. 1916 is a presidential election year. And Americans don't want to get involved in what they consider to be a European war, because that would mean sending their boys over to Europe to fight in a war that Wilson describes as a war over territory. And nobody wants that. So Wilson ends up running for and winning re-election based on this idea that he kept us out of war. In fact, his campaign motto is, he kept us out of war. So he wins in November of 1916. He's inaugurated in 1917. And guess what starts to happen? Just before he is inaugurated, the British intercept a German coded telegram, like a secret telegram to Mexico. In fact, I will show you what this telegram looks like because I have the image here. So on the left, you'll notice that these are the words are actually in groups of numbers, right? So that's the code. So the British, in intercepting it, have translated it to this message, okay? So this is, I think, just the first part or the first page of the message, I believe. I'm not entirely sure. So anyway, they intercept this coded message, and essentially the message is, hey, here's what we plan to do. What we want you to do, Mexico, is we need you to distract the Americans. So we'd like for you to start your own war with the Americans. Keep them out of this fight. If you keep them out of this fight, then what's going to happen is you will automatically be brought in on this alliance that we have. And also, technically the Japanese are doing their own thing, but the Japanese are a part of this too, which is great. And what you'll see, and this is in this section of the translation, right here. If we win, what the telegram says is this: if we win, here's what will happen. Make war together, make peace together. Generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. In other words, if we win this war, if the Triple Alliance win this war, and we win it because of your help, then you will gain the territory you lost in the Mexican-American War. You'll get Texas back, you'll get Arizona back, you'll get New Mexico back. Okay? Now, how that all works out, the settlement in detail is left to you. But that's the thing. You will inform the president of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of the war with the United States is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. So in other words, get Japan in on this, make sure that we're cool with everybody. So in other words, there are extensive plans that are being unfolded, and all of that is revealed in this secret coded plan. Zimmerman, by the way, is the German diplomat who is responsible for this message. Now, of course, after the British translate this immediately, immediately it is sent to the Americans, right? It is sent to the federal government. Oh, let me go back for a second. And given to Wilson and the Wilson administration and said, hey, are y'all going to do something about this? And Wilson says, yeah, we're going to have to do something about that for sure. And so Wilson starts to put together plans on American intervention. And in the meantime, he's going to have to start speeding things up because things are starting to fall apart in Russia as well. Russia has been going through the threat of revolution. So Tsar Nicholas is not only fighting a war in Europe, he is facing the threat of war in his own country, the threat of civil war. That revolution, of course, is the communist revolution. And the communist revolution is not just threatening a civil war, they're threatening his removal, Nicholas's removal from power, which is, of course, what they'll end up doing. By February of 1917, the communists have essentially pushed Nicholas and his family out of Moscow, and they are taken away in exile and hidden away, essentially. It's a long, drawn-out story, and by later that year, they are all executed. Him, his wife, and his children are all executed. And that is the beginning of communism in Russia. And now Wilson has a very different argument for American involvement in this war, because here are these very real threats. He says, listen, there are socialist ideas in Europe that are running amok, that while these are empires that are fighting for their position, there is socialism that is within their talks. And now you have the rise of communism in Russia after the removal of their leader, of the Tsar. It's only right and it's only necessary that the Americans get involved, right? So, of course, Wilson says we have to get involved. So by April of 1917, Wilson calls for American involvement. And the advantage there is after 3 years of European fighting, you now have fresh troops, right? Now, I want to explain something here. Fighting in World War I is very different from any previous war because it's not constant, continuous fighting. A lot of these guys are stuck in trenches, and these trenches are sometimes miles long and several feet deep, sometimes about 14, 15 feet deep. And there will be sometimes days, if not weeks, where they will go without fighting. And then there's suddenly a battle that breaks out and hundreds of them die as a result of this one battle. So the war is deadly and sometimes boring all at the same time. And when we send in these American soldiers, keep in mind that while these are quote unquote fresh troops, these are boys who in most cases have never left their hometown, let alone left their home state. Forget leaving the country, right? This is an entirely new experience, and this is an entirely new experience for the country as a whole, because now the nation is in what is considered or described as a wartime state, right? It is a question of how we redefine our industries, repurpose our industries, I should say. Things change in terms of how we talk to each other, what our priorities are. I talked about this in the previous lecture, but nobody's going to really focus on reforms anymore. Nobody's thinking about child labor as much. Nobody's really focused on whether or not companies are paying taxes to invest in their states anymore, because everybody's focused on the war effort, right? Part of that war effort is the Selective Service Act. The Selective Service Act is essentially the draft. We've had a draft before in this country. There was a draft with the Civil War, for example. So the Selective Service Act is essentially a quick way of getting men to join the ranks and be a part of the military service. There are those who don't join for religious reasons. There are though, and because of beliefs in pacifism, that they don't believe in the benefits or values or principles of war. Then there are those who don't join because they can't. They have physical issues that prevent them from fighting. They're too young, too old, whatever. Here's the thing that I want you to keep in mind. Those men who cannot go because of some sort of physical limitation are feel especially marginalized during this time, because while it's clear that they cannot go and there's a reason why they cannot go, there are plenty of people who will judge them for not going, and who will question their patriotism, question their loyalty. That's the kind of wartime state we're in. When we talk about a wartime mentality, people have these very specific and narrow definitions of patriotism, and it becomes very difficult to have to demonstrate what it means to be a patriot, especially when you are surrounded by these organizations and these agencies whose purpose is entirely around the war effort. Let's talk about one of those agencies, starting with the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board responsibility was to repurpose American industries so that industries started to produce what the American military needed for the war effort. So, for example, if a factory was making shirts, instead it would be repurposed so that they made uniforms. If a factory was making specific foods, like packaged foods, those foods would be packaged instead for soldiers. So everything was about the war effort and not about domestic production. That sort of feeds into the messaging that goes on, right? Because the federal government is going to create a brand new agency known as the Committee on Public Information, and their job is specifically about public messaging on the war effort. In front of you, you see 3 different posters created by this Committee on Public Information. The Committee on Public Information oversaw every single poster created, even if those posters were created by smaller specific groups. You'll notice the top left one, this woman is dressed in all black with the cape and a little veil on top and her gray hair here. The message, the sentiment of every American mother: America, here's my boy. So here is a mother presenting her son to fight and possibly die in war, right? So ask yourself, what is it that they are suggesting to American mothers? That is, hey moms, be ready and willing to sacrifice your children or send your children to serve in the war, because that's what every American mother would do, right? That's what every American mother is thinking. This image here, so there is a symbol for America. We often think of an image of Uncle Sam. This is Columbiana. Columbiana is the female image assigned to represent the United States. And here she is fast asleep. And the message is, wake up, America, civilization calls, right? So in other words, you can't sleep your way through the war effort. You have to wake up. You have to realize what's at stake here. This last one is particularly interesting in that you can prove your loyalty, prove your patriotism. How? By buying government bonds. Buying a government bond is basically your way of financially investing in the war, that you were loaning the government money to help pay for the war. You would get that money back based on when you wanted it back later on, but you financially investing in the war would help prove your Americanness. This is the kind of messaging that's constant. And if it's not coming from the posters, it's coming from newspaper articles, it's coming from editorials, and it's coming from people in general. There is a minister here in Oklahoma who had a flag that was hanging from his mailbox, and a group of people come by his house with a much larger flag and say, hey, you need to hang this from your porch. And the minister says, well, no, I like the one that's hanging from the mailbox. And they said, well, no, that's not big enough. This is the one that really shows your support for the American war effort. And he says, no, I'm already showing my support for the war effort. I've got a flag waving right there in front of my house. That's really all I need to do it. So when he refuses to hang the flag, the gigantic flag from his porch, they basically questioned him and they said, so are you saying that you won't hang this flag? He says, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So in this effort of vigilante justice, they take this man, again, a minister, and they beat him. They physically beat him for not hanging a flag that they want him to hang from his front porch. Keep in mind, it is a total violation of his civil liberties, but that doesn't matter in wartime America, right? Because why aren't you flying the flag that we think is appropriate? Why aren't you proving your loyalty, proving your patriotism? Why aren't you fighting? A good example of this is Theodore Roosevelt. At the time of World War I, the Secretary of the Navy is a guy named Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt happens to be married to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is Theodore Roosevelt's niece. And also, Franklin Roosevelt is Theodore's very distant cousin. Franklin Roosevelt, as Secretary of the War, remains in his position as Secretary of the Navy, not Secretary of War, but Secretary of the Navy. During the war, he wants to make sure that the Americans have what they need when they need it. Theodore Roosevelt writes to Franklin and says, you have an obligation as an American man to sign up and fight in the war effort. So he is critical of Franklin Roosevelt for not actually fighting. Keep in mind, Franklin Roosevelt is serving his country. He is serving his country as the Secretary of the Navy. But Theodore Roosevelt says, no, you have to go to the war front. Now, keep in mind, Theodore Roosevelt is, again, a little bit of a nut job. And he actually, in his late 50s, writes to Woodrow Wilson and says, hey, get me in the game. I can go out and fight in this war. Just let me in and I can serve my country too. And Woodrow Wilson says, no, absolutely not. You are a nut job. You'll probably make things worse. And you know what? That's fair. Okay. So let's talk about patriotism and these questions of patriotism and how they have a tendency to go a little too far. And that's through this issue of forced loyalty, right? So over the course of the war, this is in 1917 and 1918, there are two different laws that are passed by Congress under pressure from Woodrow Wilson. One is the Espionage Act, the other is the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act says this. And so get ready to write this out. So Espionage Act says that you are prohibited from interfering with military operations, and you are prohibited from preventing insubordination in the military. You are prohibited from interfering with military operations and preventing insubordination in the military. Here's what that means. There were people who were actively trying to protest against the draft. There were people who were actively trying to avoid the draft. That's insubordination. There were people who were encouraging young men to go AWOL, to leave the military during their training and run away. There are farmers in Oklahoma who protest the draft altogether, who don't want to join the war effort. Eugene Debs, who we talked about in the Progressive Era lecture, Eugene Debs gives a speech in which he talks about how this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Don't participate in it. Violation of this act could either lead up to a fine or get you sentenced to 10 years in jail. Because Eugene Debs is who he is, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail. So that's that. We're going to put that aside for a second and talk about the Sedition Act, okay? The Sedition Act says that it is a criminal offense to interfere with or speak out against American war efforts. It was a criminal offense to interfere with or speak out against American war efforts. So, in other words, if you write an editorial or you gave a speech somewhere, or even if you were writing a letter to a cousin, or you had a private conversation, if somebody told on you or somebody read that editorial, and in that editorial they read your words or thought of your conversation as being critical of the war effort, and by critical of the war effort, I mean you were critical of Wilson, critical of Congress, critical of the military, critical of the war in general, you could be fined, you could be arrested as well. Okay? Now, here's the irony of both of these issues. Well, yeah, for both of these. Here's Wilson making this argument that the American purpose and the American moral identity is centered around the ideas and values of democracy, right? He says our job and our responsibility to the rest of the world is to present ourselves as the role models, as the leaders of democracy, and it's our job to help others achieve these goals in democracy. Yet and still, during this war for the principles of democracy, he is overseeing and campaigning for the Espionage and Sedition Acts that are basic violations of First Amendment rights. They are telling you that you are not allowed, you are being denied freedom of expression and freedom to have or your ability to express your own opinions. You cannot do that. And freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy, right? Especially of our democracy. Your ability to criticize your leaders, your ability to criticize your government is the cornerstone of any democracy, but especially ours, right? That's why it's the First Amendment. And here's Wilson saying, yeah, we love democracy. We are the best democracy in the world. Mumble, mumble, you shouldn't have the first access to the First Amendment anymore. Yes, you have access to the First Amendment, but with conditions, right? That's the great irony of Woodrow Wilson. This is, again, one of many problems that I have with Woodrow Wilson. Let's get into some of the other issues I have with him. A part of the debate that happens during this time, we kind of touched upon in the progressive era. When we talked at the end, I told you about why the progressive era comes to an end, that it's not just the war, that there are other issues that take place. And it's this question about who can qualify to be an American. Just so you know, if you haven't been paying attention to this, this has been an ongoing theme, right? Because during Reconstruction, there are guys like Andrew Johnson who say, okay, you have all of these freed people, but they should not be citizens. Then it evolves. That argument evolves to where, sure, you have citizens, but if they are working class or they are people of color, they should have only certain access to the rights of citizens and that sort of thing. So this question of American identity, particularly during the war, is going to be a racial issue, and it's also going to be a classist issue. We're going to get to class in just a moment. I want to focus on race for a second. Let me bring back Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson, among his many, many qualities, character traits, is a clear out and out racist. So, at the federal level, especially during the years of Lincoln going forward, at the federal level, there were black and white employees working together. They had worked together as co-workers in the same offices. And it was no problem. So at the federal level, there was no segregation. They had been integrated and working together just fine, just swimmingly, until Woodrow Wilson shows up. When Wilson shows up, one of the first things that he does is he segregates the federal level of work. So black workers and white workers are immediately separated. And then pretty early on in his presidency, he has a film screening at the White House for a film called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is written and directed by another well-known racist named D.W. Griffith, who writes the story or tells the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but primarily Reconstruction, in which he says that here were these Confederates who fought for the greatness of America, and then instead what ends up happening is all of these black men took over positions of leadership and they had no idea what they were doing. They made a mockery of American government. Also, black men were attacking white women, and it was a complete and total destruction of American society, and Reconstruction was the worst time in American history. That's what the film is about. And Wilson says it's one of the greatest films he's ever seen. He loves this film. One of the things that you need to understand is Wilson is born and raised in Virginia. And he lived during the time of Reconstruction. So as a child, he witnessed these Confederate soldiers coming home defeated and in despair. And that's going to be important for you to remember later on. But the other thing for you to remember is that it absolutely shapes his perspective on race. And there is a major race issue at stake here because, that's not what I want. Because what ends up happening is in this time period, in the 19-teens, the country had become much more ethnically diverse. We've talked about this, right? With more immigrants showing up, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then you have Chinese immigrants showing up. There are different groups of people who have now arrived. And a study is done about 45 different quote unquote races and what their characteristics were. And this study, and I'm saying study with air quotes, this study qualified these races from highest to lowest. Okay. Now, one of the things that I want you to understand about race is not biological, right? Biologically, we are all the same. There might be genetic differences for all sorts of environmental reasons, but biologically, we are fundamentally the same. Okay. Race itself is a social construct, it is a social category created to divide people into groups. And so this study used those categories to justify discriminatory practices in things like hiring and housing. And these practices would continue on for centuries. And this is not just for the United States, this would be globally. That brings me back to the practice of eugenics, which we talked about in the previous lecture, right? The so-called science of of looking at the characteristics of people, but specifically the mental characteristics of people. This is something that Woodrow Wilson fully embraces. Wilson believes that eugenics helps us better understand the need for racial purity. He says, actually, it's not just him, a lot of progressives who buy into this eugenics nonsense agree that you can cure society's problems like poverty and prostitution if you can control reproduction. If you only have the best people having children and you don't allow the others to have babies. This sort of thing is quite prevalent in the mindset of Americans. Now, what does this have to do with American society during the war? Well, when we are talking about what's happening during the war and why this matters, there's something that's been happening that you probably should know about in a larger context. That is this idea of Americanization. Americanization is the process of creating a more American identity, right? This is the idea that you would promote a so-called national language, that you would pressure immigrants to assimilate, become more American. Americanization would even hold a loyalty day where people marched in a parade to demonstrate how loyal they were to the United States. And one guy who is particularly critical of things like that is a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black man to graduate from Harvard. He was a historian, a philosopher, a writer. And eventually he becomes an educator and a civil rights activist. And he is, we talked a few lectures ago about Booker T. Washington. Remember, Booker T. Washington is the guy who says that Black people need to not be activists. They should not demand for equality. So just as a reminder, W.E.B. Du Bois will be Booker T. Washington's biggest and loudest critic. Du Bois writes this book called The Souls of Black Folk. And in The Souls of Black Folk, these are just essentially a collection of essays that are about identity. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It's designed to empower Black Americans. And in it, he basically says that the biggest problem for Black Americans, for African Americans in the United States, is that their identity has been projected onto them. In other words, other people have been telling them who they are, what they can do, what they cannot do, what they're capable of doing. And as a result, they didn't realize or they didn't fully realize what kind of potential they had, all of the abilities they held, and all of the possibilities they could reach, right? And this is really important in the face of Americanization, where Americanization is this constant message of this is what you are supposed to be. This is the square in which you are supposed to fit, right? This is the kind of American you need to be in a time of war, right? This is important because there is this constant message of this is what a patriot looks like. A patriot is supposed to know every single verse of the Star Spangled Banner. A patriot is supposed to make sure that he salutes or does this and that for the Pledge of Allegiance. And a patriot is supposed to, I don't know, get a tattoo of the flag on their shoulder. I don't know. But, whatever your definitions of patriotism are, it's very specific to what one person or a group of people want. And Du Bois is basically arguing that doesn't work. Because when somebody projects their ideas of identity onto you, it immediately limits your understanding of what you are capable of doing, right? So what ends up happening is Du Bois will be responsible for pushing for this idea that Black Americans embrace chasing after who they are, figuring out what their own potential is. How do we embrace this sense of identity, right? And that's really important, particularly because Du Bois is going to be responsible for helping to establish this organization, the NAACP. The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. It's an association that still exists to this day, and we are going to talk about this group more throughout the remaining lectures, so make sure you are familiar with them later on. The NAACP is an advocacy group. They are an activist group. It will have lawyers in it. It will have activists in it, and they are designed to advocate for people of color for this exact purpose. When your identity and your potential has been projected onto you, this is how you fight back against that, right? This is particularly important in the 19-teens because right before, as the war is starting, and we're talking about 1914 itself, so even before the American involvement in the war, there is a shift that happens in the population makeup of cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And that is what will be called the Great Migration. So from 1900 to 1920, hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave the South and move to these cities in the Midwest and in the Northeast because of job opportunities. This number hits its peaks during the war years because that's when the jobs really hit their peaks, right? Because of war industries and stuff. But what happens as a result is this idea of population disruption, that there are people, white people in particular, who are very unsettled by the number of Black people who are showing up in their relatively white states, right? The number of Black people who are showing up in Michigan, for example, or in Indiana, or in Pennsylvania, not Indiana, but Illinois and in Pennsylvania. So what starts to happen is a very aggressive response. And this aggressive response is going to result in things like racial riots, right? Chicago is one of note, right? So I want you to notice the wording that is used in this headline, because what ends up happening is it's a hot summer day in July in Chicago, and black kids and white kids are all in the lake trying to cool off, swimming, and a young black kid accidentally gets into the white side of the water because it's water. Now, keep in mind, it's water. Water floats everywhere. So I don't know what white side versus black side means. But notice that the headline says that he invaded the white district. What they mean is he came into the white side of the water. What happens as a result is some young white men, teenagers, throw stones at him. The stones hit his head. He tries to swim back. He ends up drowning. And as a result, a fight breaks out. A huge fight breaks out that only gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this riot lasts for a few days. Now, here's the thing. So the riot overall, now this headline talks about 3 are dead, 50 are hurt. The 3 dead are black, 50 hurt are from both races. But the other thing that this headline doesn't mention is the fact that over the course of this race riot, there are police officers and white people from outside of the area who go to the black neighborhoods and burn down black houses. And what makes that even worse is when these black families apply for insurance claims, try to make their claims to get reimbursement or try to get some kind of help, they are denied their insurance claims because of how they lost their homes. And the insurance companies say that that kind of coverage is not included in their contracts. So it is absolutely devastating. This sort of thing is happening across the country. And as I told you in the previous lecture, it culminates in the Tulsa Race Massacre, where there are tensions that result over the success of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, that these are economically and socially advanced black people in Tulsa living in their own neighborhoods, shopping at their own stores, going to their own schools, and doing incredibly well. So in other words, they've achieved the American dream and they're doing it on their own terms. And that's really a problem for white neighborhoods on the other side of the tracks where people are struggling and dealing with a lot of economic hardship. And they are stoked by outsiders like members of the Klan who say, hey, why are those black people living better than you are? That's an issue. And all that was needed to actually cause this to erupt in a massacre is a young woman who comes running out of the elevator because a young black man was in the elevator with her. Now, keep in mind, the young girl doesn't say anything. She just runs out of the elevator. It's the store clerk who sees her running. She's the woman who calls the police and accuses the young black man of raping her. And that's what leads to these race riots, right? These are the kind of tensions that have been building for a few years. And it doesn't help that the tone has been set by the President of the United States, and it's at a time of war, right? And he does little to nothing to address it. He does little to nothing to really settle it, right? And on top of all of that, by the end of the war, and I'm just giving you a preview to this, by the end of the war, fears of communists, fears of communist invasions are going to paralyze the country as well, right? Which becomes really problematic. So in the meantime, where the heck is Wilson? Well, Wilson is in Paris. And Wilson decides to go to Paris because he believes he's the guy to negotiate the end of the war. For a couple of years now, even before the Americans enter the war, Wilson puts together a group of people and says, hey, you need to look into how we can end this war. And he says, I want you to research why the war started, what were the reasons behind it, and let's come up with a plan. The plan that they come up with is called the 14 points. Okay? So, in the 14 points, which he presents to Congress in January of 1918, which you can see here on the right, each point is addressing a specific issue that had somehow, in some way, led to the breakout of the war. And ultimately, his goal in using these 14 points is to make sure that this kind of war never happens again. That's the goal, okay? That if this war is happening, we don't ever want something like this to ever happen again. Now, we're not going to go over each of the 14 points. However, when we talk about his plan and the intention behind this plan, his most important point is the very last one, the 14th point. He says the biggest reason that this war broke out, the one thing that really could have stopped this war, is there was no accountability. There was nothing in place to prevent anybody from getting out of control. So he proposes establishing what he calls an association of nations. And in fact, you'll see that right here. He calls it a general association of nations. He says the general associations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. In other words, what he is saying is for the protection of every nation around the world, to make sure that each nation's sovereignty is protected, their political identity is ensured, you need a general association of nations. Essentially, at this general association, each nation would have an ambassador representing each country, and that's where you would talk out all of your international concerns. So we're not going to talk about domestic issues. We don't go to this general association to talk about, Texas's problems with, environmental concerns that they have, in West Texas. That's not what this association is going to do. Instead, if the United States has a problem with Canada, then this association is where we hash it out. International concerns are brought to this general association, and this is where we negotiate. This is where we make sure that nobody gets out of control. He says, listen, if there is a dictator somewhere, or if there is somebody who's trying to spread their empire and do it by force, this is where we can prevent that. Okay? Now, here's the problem. When Wilson goes to Paris to negotiate the end of this war, Wilson goes and only takes Democrats with him, which is a problem because Congress is under the control of Republicans. And when you have a treaty for the United States, the treaty can't just be signed and passed. The treaty has to come back to Congress. It has to go through a couple of committees, and then it has to be voted on and approved by Congress, particularly the Senate. You can't just sign a treaty and call it good. So if he were politically wise, Wilson would have taken Republicans with him, especially Republicans who were on, foreign affairs committees and that sort of thing. So that way they have input and they could help with these negotiations. But Wilson is Wilson, so of course he did not do that. The second thing that you should know is Wilson goes there and stays in Paris for 6 months. So think about this for a second. We are a country that is in racial turmoil. There are all sorts of things happening that lead to a lot of uncertainty and chaos. And the President of the United States is gone for 6 months in the name of trying to negotiate peace. So here's how Wilson gets embarrassed. When Wilson goes to Paris, Germany is not even brought to the negotiating table. At the negotiating table, it is Wilson, it is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, it is the Prime Minister from France, and it's the leader of Italy. During the war, Italy switches sides. Let's not get into why. These are the big four. These are the four countries represented at the negotiating table. The United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Germany is nowhere in this conversation. Okay? Wilson says you have to have Germany as a part of this conversation because remember, as a little boy, this is a guy who watched Confederate soldiers walk around in defeat. He knows what happens when soldiers come home defeated, morose, broken. And he is afraid of what will happen to the Germans if they are punished, right? Because Wilson knows what happens to the South as a result of Reconstruction policies and things like military reconstruction, right? He doesn't want that to happen to Germany. So as he comes to this negotiating table, the problem for him is Great Britain, France, and Italy don't care about Germany. They don't want to negotiate with Germany. They want to punish Germany. They want to punish Kaiser Wilhelm. They want to destroy everything that contributed to this war. And here's the thing, the German people are like, hey, that Kaiser Wilhelm is out of here. We've sent him away. In fact, he ends up in exile. So we have nothing to do with him. We're ready and willing to compromise. But the other three countries don't care. And when they see this plan that Wilson has for peace, they laugh at him. And one by one, all of his points are tossed out of the window, except for the 14th point. So they will sign this peace treaty known as the Versailles Treaty. There are a lot of treaties, by the way, that are known as the Versailles Treaty. This is the Versailles Treaty that ends World War I. And the only thing that Wilson gets is the 14th point, which, by the way, the Americans never agreed to. That's a whole separate story. If you want to know why, ask me and I will tell you why. But we won't get into that here. I want to tell you the problems with the Versailles Treaty, okay? Because that will help us transition into the very end of this lecture. In this treaty, they are specifically targeting Germany, and this is what they say. Germany has to do three major things. Germany has to, one, pay the entire debt of the war. So not just their debt. They have to pay Russia's debt. They have to pay the United Kingdom's debt. They have to pay France's debt, Italy's debt. They have to pay all of Northern Europe's debt. They have to pay America's debt. They have to pay Austria-Hungary's debt. They have to pay everybody's debt. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. It's all entirely on them. And keep in mind, Germany has no real infrastructure anymore. Their entire industrial complex is gone. Factories have been destroyed. They have lost millions of people because they have died in the war, right? They've got nothing. Here's the other thing. Germany is also, along those lines, Germany has to give up territory. So the German Empire no longer exists, right? The German Empire no longer exists. They have to give up territory. They have to give up territory to other countries. So France is getting territory back. The Netherlands are getting territory back. All sorts of countries are getting territory back. And Germany is getting chopped up into pieces, basically. The third, and perhaps the most consequential, is that Germany has to publicly admit their role in causing the war. In other words, they have to take the blame for World War I. They are shamed. They are publicly shamed for World War I. And that's going to be an issue. Now, that's just something that I want you to keep in mind. Now, the League of Nations, which is the 14th point that Wilson wanted, the League of Nations is established. Great Britain, France, and Italy have the most prominent roles. The U.S. would have if we had joined, but we did not. We did not ratify the treaty. We won't get into that. So I want to talk about what happens as a result of the war, but specifically because of this treaty, okay? There are a few things that happen as a result. One, it plants the seeds for the Great Depression. The 1920s, and for the United States, the end of the 1920s, will be economically devastating. And a lot of that is because of the conditions of the treaty. By placing the entire debt of the war on Germany, you are guaranteeing that you are taking Germany out of the economic picture. Germany is never going to be able to pay that debt. Never. And Great Britain and France were counting on Germany to pay that debt so that they could pay the United States back for all of the loans that we gave them so that they could fight the war. But that's not going to happen. In the meantime, what ends up happening is because Germany has no infrastructure in place and they don't have any money, whatever money they have has to go towards this debt, nobody can invest in rebuilding Germany. So they're starting from scratch, but they don't even have scratch to start with, right? The other thing that happens as a result of this is a deep sense of anti-Western nationalism. By Western, I don't just mean anti-America. It's also anti-Great Britain, anti-France. It's this idea of anti-democracy. This mentality that democracy is not all that it's chalked up to be. And that maybe there is something more valuable to an autocratic style of government. That maybe you get more out of one guy being in charge. And this is not just something that's going to happen in Germany. This is going to happen in Italy. This is going to happen in Japan. And that's going to be prevalent. This is also going to happen in Spain. But this is something that you should keep an eye on because it's going to lead to what will become the Second World War. This idea of shaming Germany on a global stage creates a level of bitterness and anger that Wilson, to his credit, and I don't say that often, to his credit, Wilson predicts, right? Wilson says, if you don't end this war correctly, if you don't have the right peace treaty, then you're going to get another war like this, except that next war is going to be bigger, it will be more devastating, it will be deadlier. If you don't watch yourself, the next war is going to be worse than this war. And he is exactly right. Because what ends up happening is a corporal who fought in World War I, is going to watch what happens to Germany, and then he's going to take that shame and he's going to turn it into a talking point. And he starts campaigning on that. And he says, listen, the Kaiser had the right idea, he just didn't have the right strategy. But if you follow me, I can help fulfill that vision. I can help Germany find its place in the sun. That corporal is Adolf Hitler, right? He builds on the bitterness. He builds on the anger, the hate, the anti-Western sentiment, all of that to lead to what will be World War II. The feelings, the tensions, the rivalries, none of that goes away after World War I. Just because they signed a peace treaty doesn't mean there's actually peace. What there means is somebody's pressed the pause button, and it's only a matter of time before somebody presses play again.